In the previous episode of Finding Time, we explored the lands of Crook, County Waterford as part of our By Crook Series. Using our survey from 1787, this time, we'll cross over into County Wexford to travel across the Hook Peninsula and attempt to find what landmarks remain standing. First stop, the village of Passage East to catch a ferry to Ballyhack on our way to Hook. Just before reaching the peninsula is Templetown. The area is named after the Knights Templar, who created a settlement there in the 12th century. In the year 1307, the lands were handed over to the Knights Hospitallers, who erected a fortified church in the site of a previous Templar church. A blend of old and new emerges as we view the old Norman tower built by the Knights Hospitallers alongside an early 19th century church building. The foundations of an earlier Templar church rest just south of the Norman style tower. One face of the old Templar church is visible in a 19th century sketch by George Dunoyer, but all that remains of the old church today are its foundations peeking through the soil. Content with our footage at Templetown, we moved on, first visiting Houselands to gain access to the site of Houseland Castle, but as the owners of the lands were not home at the time, we pushed on to St. Brecón's Church, just south of the farm, saving Houseland for later in our trip. St. Brecón's Church is in serious ruin, and only a fragment of it remains. The church has been slowly falling into the sea as the cliff face below it erodes. Surveys in 1835, 1929 and 1987 found fragments of Olmstone at the site. Excavations also revealed the structure is built on the foundations of an earlier church. Comparing the 1833 and 1888 Ordnance Survey maps, the rapid erosion of the fragile coastline is very evident. Unless something is done soon to reinforce the site, The remaining ruins of the church will be swallowed by the waves that etch the cliff face beneath it. After finishing filming St. Brockhawn's Church, we travelled a short distance down the road to Loftus Hall, a large mansion on the west of the peninsula. Loftus Hall is known for many reasons. The most common is a story about a stranger who knocked on the door on a stormy night during the 1700s seeking shelter. The Tottenham family invited him in and he spent some time with them. The daughter of the family, Anne, grew fond of the stranger. One night while playing a game of cards at the table, a card fell to the ground. Anne bent down to pick it up, and while looking under the table, she noticed the stranger had hooves instead of feet. When she sat back up, the stranger shot through the roof and vanished. Anne became mentally ill afterwards and was locked away by her family, dying a few years later, having never recovered from the ordeal. The history of the site of Loftus Hall goes all the way back to the Norman invasion of 1170, where Norman castles sprung up around the peninsula. The Redmonds built one of the earliest castles in the area at Houseland. Later on they moved a short distance down the peninsula, where they built a castle on the site of Loftus Hall. The castle was called Redmond Hall, and it stayed in the Redmond family until the invasion of Ireland by Cromwell. In 1642, in the midst of the Irish-Confederate Wars, English soldiers attacked Redmond Hall in an attempt to secure its possession. A resilient Alexander Redmond, along with his two sons and a handful of tenants, fought off almost 100 English soldiers until assistance arrived from the Irish Confederates. The English soldiers were defeated and pushed back. Alexander Redmond passed away a few years later in 1651, and his family were evicted by Cromwell, despite being given assurances that they would remain in the residence. Nicholas Loftus, an English planter, was given the land surrounding Redmond Hall, and he assumed control of the castle, which became the home of the Loftus family. The original Redmond Castle is no more, and has long been replaced by today's more modern mansion. Finishing up at Loftus Hall, we pressed on to Slade Castle on the southeast of the peninsula. Slade Castle is very well preserved and is a hidden gem in the area. It sits next to a small pier which serves some local fishermen. Slade was built by the Laffin family in the 15th century. First starting out as a tower house, it had expansions in the 16th and 17th centuries. The evolution of the castle is shown on a plaque which hangs from one of its entrances. We then ventured on to the prime location of Hook Head, the Hook Lighthouse. The current tower dates back to the beginning of the 13th century, when it was built by a Norman knight, William Marshall. Early on, the tower functioned as a primitive lighthouse operated by monks, until they were replaced by a more permanent lighthouse keeper in the 17th century. The lighthouse was often described as Hook Castle on multiple maps in the area. For 800 years, it has saved countless sailors from the perils of the waters that surround it. While those very waters were carrying boats into Waterford Harbour, they were also carving away at the rock face below the lighthouse, where upon closer inspection, you can see an abundance of fossils in the rock bed. The fossils date all the way back to the lower Carboniferous period, over 300 million years ago. The fossils consist of coral, brachiopods and bryozoans. Examining the rock bed, by pure coincidence, I came across a brachiopod fossil I had discovered 7 years prior and had submitted to the fossil logging website, fossil.net. Ireland is not known for its fossil records, so if you visit Hook, be sure to take advantage and inspect the rocks as you cross them. Leaving Hook Lighthouse, we ventured back up the peninsula, stopping at St. Dubhán's church along the way to capture some footage. The original site was said to have been built by a Welsh monk called Dubhán in the 5th century, from which the area Hook gets its name. The current church dates back to the 13th or 14th century. Centuries before Hook Lighthouse existed, St. Dubhán was said to have lit beacons along the headlands to warn nearby ships. The final sight of the day to me was the one I looked forward to the most. It was the sight of Houseland Castle. We travelled north along the peninsula to Castle Farm and Houseland. We met with the owners of the land to get permission to film, and they were very gracious hosts, inviting us in for a chat about the history of the area. I've travelled the Hook Peninsula many times, and I'd seen the other landmarks before, but I had never heard of Houseland Castle until seen on an 18th century map of Waterford Harbour. Houseland Castle was one of the earliest Norman castles built on the Hook Peninsula. It was said to have been built by the Redmond family at the end of the 12th century. The castle was a typical Norman tower house, which had 4 floors. It stood until the early 1900s, where 2 storm events in the early and mid parts of the century tore it down to its foundations. 2 images of the castle exist, a sketch by George Dunoyer from the 19th century, and a photograph of the castle from the 1920s. All that remains today are the foundations of the castle sticking up out of the soil on top of a mound in the field. It's easy to make out the straight lines of the walls in the stonework. A curious second mound exists just upfield from the castle foundations, perhaps the remnants of further castle works. And for every castle was a source of water for its occupants, and Houseland Castle was no different. Just down from the castle on the old OSI maps was Houseland Well. I couldn't find a trace of the well on my visit, but I couldn't verify the exact location due to poor internet signal. Something for another time. In the next field up from the castle are the ruins of a mill. The mill is visible on the 1888 OSI map. I suspect the mill was built during the 1700s at some point, but has long been in ruins. The story of Houseland Castle is a sad one, and is one reflected across Ireland in the many castles we lost due to poor preservation. The castle must be surely responsible for many a tale, but they're all lost now to the soil on which its final foundations rest.